Let's bring in Bridget McKenzie. She's the National Senate leader. Joins me now. I don't think you'd be disagreeing with what Marion Scrimgeour has said. In fact, it sounds a lot like what the National said a few months ago.
Yeah, absolutely, Kieran. I mean, I've been up in the Territory post the election talking to local community leaders, school principals, and even then the impact of the Labor Territory government's decision to allow grog back into communities post the end of the Stronger Futures legislation, the ending of the cashless debit card, etc. Those policy decisions by Territory and federal Labor government were already being felt months ago. The police were exhausted, local community scared and worried in a town that they'd lived in their entire life, and nobody has lifted a finger. It's an indictment on both the Territory government and now the federal government. For Marion to say,
the coalition be pushing now and introducing a reintroduction of those alcohol bans, which can be done out of the federal parliament?
Well, absolutely. We need to throw the book at this problem. This is not some faraway place. This is Australia. This is happening in a community of ours, and we actually have a responsibility to do something. I find it incredible that Marion, as the local MP there, someone who sits in Anthony Albanese's caucus, who is an Indigenous voice in his government, is not being listened to. And I want to know whether Anthony Albanese, whether it's going to wait till his referenda constitutional voice actually says to him this is a problem at the end of 2023 before the federal Labor government actually gets involved. They can fix this. They can get involved. He should be on the ground with the Chief Minister tomorrow in Alice Springs to see firsthand, because I think it's very easy for us that live on the East Coast, Kieran, and in capital cities.
But, just to say to the Prime Minister he should visit Alice Springs this week, what would you say to the argument that that's just a symbolic move as opposed to what really needs to happen?
Well, I don't think you can go there and face-to-face sit down with the people that are being impacted by this level of violence and abuse, that you can sit down and talk with community leaders, with exhausted police and school teachers and nurses and doctors who are dealing at the coalface of this, what's been described as a war zone in Alice Springs. I don't think a Prime Minister would be able to sit down and have those conversations and come back here and say it's all going to be fixed by a voice, because it won't be. We've known this is coming. We've seen it, anyone on the ground knew that this was increasing and escalating over time. And it's time for Anthony Albanese to listen to the Indigenous voices in his own government who are saying this has to be the priority for us, not putting up the symbolic voice.
Well, Marion Scrimgeour did say on Melbourne radio today that we can't be talking about the voice and so on without dealing with this. So it did come from, as you said, the member for Lingiari, a Labor MP, and as we heard from John Boffa earlier, it's not just Conservative figures like Natasha Fyles who are saying that an intervention needs to happen. He said it, a respected GP in Alice for many years, that not only the return of the ban, but another intervention, that other interventions need to be considered, like potentially federal police. Well,
this is the indictment, I guess, on the Territory government, knowing that that Stronger Futures legislation had a sunset, was ending, and despite numerous recommendations and reports on what to put in place so that when that end date did occur, it wasn't just about stopping the flow of grog. There were a whole suite of recommendations about how to secure a better future for Indigenous communities and individuals around Alice and in the Territory, and they didn't implement them. So when I talk to colleagues in the Territory who live in Alice, who work around this, they cannot believe that despite numerous opportunities, the Labor government in the Territory didn't lift a finger and basically sat numb and watch this disaster occur.
Dr Boffa, he also said, when I spoke to him earlier this afternoon, that potentially the voice could work in a scenario like this because Indigenous leaders would have said, no, this ban is working, it needs to stay. So if there was a voice to Parliament, that potentially it could have had an impact, a positive impact in that sense.
Yeah, well,
What do you say to that?
I think, Kieran, one of the things that we do support in the National Party is obviously the local and regional voices. I mean, we're Conservatives, we think localism is important. I mean, that's why a little party like ours comes to a big place like Canberra to stand up for the people that don't live in the regions. So in our government, we supported local and regional voices being set up and having input into advising levels of government, etc. Now, if that had have been put in place, if the Labor government had have continued that trajectory, that was a recommendation out of the Calmer and Langton report, the local and regional voices, then absolutely the government, Albanese's government, would have been actually hearing that months ago. But they've put a halt on that, and they're chasing instead a national voice and the referenda. In what I can say in the circumstances that we're hearing about today, I completely agree with the Labor member of Lingiari, is not the right priority for the government at the moment.
Members of the Northern Territory government suggest that a grog ban, the legacy of the Stronger Futures laws are racist in their approach. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it is racist for us to actually think that Black children, Aboriginal children and Aboriginal communities should not have the same opportunities, the same right to safety and security that other children have in this country. If this was happening in a suburb in Melbourne, you tell me that Premier wouldn't be making sure that actually those people were safe and secure, but because it is far away, and maybe it is because they are Indigenous Australians that we care a little less. It is an indictment on both the Territory Labor government and Anthony Albanese. We as a coalition will not stand in the way of throwing any level of resource to actually ensure both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Territorian safety at this time.
The ban was lifted last year. It was halfway through last year, so it was before the federal Labor government was elected. So when you say it's an indictment on the Prime Minister, he wasn't elected at the time. The ban, I'm just putting
Kieran, I'm happy to answer
the history on that.
Well, as I said earlier,
it was the Northern Territory.
The Northern Territory government
didn't move when it
did not
lapsed.
move when it had to, and I know the opposition in the Territory has been likening what's happening in Alice at the moment as akin to a natural disaster. People are unsafe. We need to actually be throwing the book at it as we would in any other disaster.
So should the government have imposed those bans last year from a federal level?
Well, the understanding was, and the agreement was, that the Territory government was to have mechanisms in place when that Stronger Future legislation lapsed. Now, it turned out it didn't. And the grog has flowed, and there aren't the support structures around there, and there are recommendations that indeed the Territory had available to them to implement, and they did not do it.
So, to wrap up, finally, in your view, you believe the Prime Minister should visit?
Absolutely. You can't ignore it when you see it.
The federal police should be deployed as well, and that if need be, that those bans be reinstated via the federal parliament.
If that's what's required, then that's what's required. I think for Anthony Albanese as the Prime Minister to stay locked up in Canberra whilst this is occurring in our country, if it was a natural disaster, he'd be on the first VIP out of here after a cabinet meeting. He needs to treat this with the same seriousness.
Nationals Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Always, Kieran.